Ayin, we are in Daf Samach Tes Amid Beis. Just a few lines from the bottom. The Mishnah gave multiple scenarios of where someone had forgotten an Eruv, or two people had forgotten to put Eruv, meaning they forgot to put in bread into the communal meal. And now somebody has to relinquish rights to the courtyard in order for it to be a single entity. And the question is who relinquished to whom. So if the group, the Eruv group, relinquishes its right to the person who forgot the Eruv, so fine, that would work for him. If there are two people who forgot the Eruv and the group relinquishes to them, that would not be valid, because now you still have two entities there. The two people who forgot now received the rights to the courtyard, and that's two entities, and they didn't make an Eruv with each other, and so that's going to be invalid. So Gemara says, Pshita, that seems pretty obvious. It's like you didn't have an Eruv. The Mishnah means that it's going to prohibit it, even if one of them now tries and relinquishes his right that he received from the group to the other. Perhaps you think that would be permissible. Kamash Malan, so this teaches us that it's no good. The kivan the beidna the batale lahai shriyusa bechazim. That it doesn't work, because at the moment that the group relinquish its rights to the courtyard to the two individuals, neither of them were now permissible in carrying the courtyard. And the reason why Chachamim made this ability or this right to relinquish the rights to them is so that they can carry. But if they can't carry anyhow, that never worked, and so he doesn't have the rights to then further relinquish it to his fellow. So the Mishnah then makes a summary that one person can relinquish rights and receive rights. And two people can relinquish their rights but cannot receive rights. So what do we need that repetition for? So hasu lamali. So what is that additional summary for? E naisin tanina. If it's to tell you that an individual can relinquish his rights to the group, that we already learned. E notail, if that an individual can receive rights that are relinquished to him. Tanina, we learned that too. Sefer Tzricha. So you're right. It's there really to tell us the second part, which is when there are multiple people who forgot the Eruv. Shnayim Noser Rishus, that two people can relinquish their rights. Hanami Pshita, that too seems pretty obvious. If one person can, two people can, and they relinquish their rights to the group. The Gemara says, Ma'u de Tema Ligzar Dilma Asal of Tulilu. The Gemara says, no, there's a concern. Maybe that the next part, the Mishnah says, which we'll see in a moment, is that you cannot relinquish two people. That's invalid. So perhaps two people may not relinquish their rights because they cannot receive rights from others that relinquish. Therefore, the Mishnah says, no, that you can still do. Two people can relinquish their rights to the group. Kamash Malan, that it's still good. Now at the top of Ayin Amid Aleph, Ve'ein Notlin Rishus, and they have no right to receive permission, meaning two people cannot receive the relinquishment of the group in the courtyard. Salam Ali. What do I need this teaching? We already said in the line before that two people cannot receive, because if they do, there's two entities and they will prohibit to each other. It's there to tell you that even if they make a deal prior to receiving the relinquished courtyard, where the group relinquishes to them, prior to that, one says to the other, look, we're going to receive it together, but then you will receive it on my behalf and you're going to relinquish to me as well. Still, nevertheless, it's not going to be good, because it has to be that it's relinquished to an individual. As we said before, that since he can never acquire it, and he himself cannot have at the moment that the group relinquished to the two of them, neither of them had the rights to carry in the courtyard, so it never worked, and so he cannot pass it on to the other. So Baimine Abaya mi Rabba. So Abaya asked his teacher Rabba a question. Chamisha sheshruyim, and this is in this idea where somebody forgets to participate in the Eruv, and he's going to relinquish rights or have it relinquished him. So, 5 people live in a courtyard, and one of them forgot and didn't participate in putting a bread into the bread basket, didn't participate in the Eruv. When he relinquishes his rights, does he have to do so to each one of the others? Or since they made an Eruv, they are a single entity, and he can relinquish it to one, and that's sufficient? Amar le, he has to relinquish to each individual separately. So Abaye challenged that. And the Bryce is going to tell us multiple cases. An individual who forgot to partake in Eruv can relinquish his rights to one. And the Gemara is going to deal with who is this, in what scenario does he relinquish to one? Because this one that he's relinquishing his rights to, it says, the one that made an Eruv, meaning that there are multiple people there, because otherwise with whom did he make an Eruv? So there are multiple people, and yet it says that he relinquishes to one other people, one of the other people, one other person. So this seems not like Rabba, who says they have to relinquish to each one, because here it says that one who did not make an Eruv can relinquish to one that did make an Eruv, presumably with someone else, because otherwise it's not an Eruv. That means there's multiple people, and he only relinquishes to one. So that's going to be the question to Rabba. But the Brisa continues. Shnayim she'irvu, two people who did make an Eruv, they can relinquish their rights, meaning the group can relinquish the rights to an individual who didn't make an Eruv. Or two that did not make an Eruv, multiple people forgot to make an Eruv, they can relinquish to the group, to two that did make an Eruv. Or they can relinquish to one person who didn't make an Eruv. But one who did make an Eruv cannot relinquish his rights to somebody who did not make an Eruv. He's prohibiting it for the person he made an Eruv with. If he relinquishes his right to the courtyard to the one who didn't make an Eruv, he now invalidates the Eruv or it doesn't invalidate the Eruv, but he makes it so that the other person who put the bread into the Eruv basket is not going to be allowed to carry. So he can't do it on his behalf. He has to. They have to do it together. Also, two people who didn't make an Eruv cannot relinquish their rights to someone, to two people that didn't make an Eruv, because again, that's going to be invalid, because you're going to end up with multiple entities anyhow. Or two people who didn't make an Eruv cannot relinquish their rights to two people who did not make an Eruv, because again, it's going to end up with two entities. So that's the end of that brisa. So now Abai explains in the first line we learned, Katanim Hias, Reisha in the first line, one who didn't make an Eruv can relinquish to one who did make an Eruv. Now, what's the case? Either is there only two people in the courtyard and one didn't make the Eruv and one did make the Eruv? Well, then he didn't make an Eruv, because who did he make an Eruv with? You said one made an Eruv. With whom? An Eruv means that you've mixed, you've joined in with someone. But even if you put a bread in a basket, but no one else did, so that's not an Eruv. You didn't join with anyone. Must be there's someone else there. And yet it says that the one who's relinquishing, it's sufficient for him to relinquish to one of the group of the Eruv. So that's Abaya's proof from the simple reading of this brisa that it must be that even though there are multiple people here, because it says he made an Eruv, the one who didn't make an Eruv is relinquishing to one of them. So you see, you don't have to relinquish to everybody. V'Rabba, and Rabba responds, yeah, the case is that there's only one other person right now. At the onset of Shabbos, there were multiple people in this courtyard, and they made an Eruv. So you had two people in the courtyard that made an Eruv, and one didn't. A total of 3 inhabitants of the courtyard. Now, one of the ones that made an Eruv passed away. So there's only one left. The one who didn't make an Eruv can relinquish to the one who did make an Eruv, and then it'll be a valid Eruv. So the Gemara says, wait, either have or miss, if there was somebody there and then he died, meaning there were multiple people and then he died, let's look at a later case. The one who did make an Eruv cannot relinquish to the one who did not make an Eruv. And we explain the reason is because the two people that made an Eruv, if only one relinquishes to the one who didn't make an Eruv, he's invalidating the other person's Eruv, and he won't be able to carry. So he can't act on behalf of the other. But if that person is dead already, that's the scenario of the brisa, that we're left with one person who made an Eruv and one didn't. So then what's the problem? The ida havo miss. If that third person was there at the onset of Shabbat but is no longer there, why can't he make the Eruv? He's only acting on behalf of himself because the other person is no longer there. Again, the scenario that the brisa that Rab is proposing, the brisa is talking about, is that there are 3 people in the courtyard. 2 of them made an Eruv, 1 didn't. In the first case, the one made an Eruv, the one that didn't make an Eruv is relinquishing his rights to the one who did make an Eruv. And Rabbi is saying, and the reason he has to relinquish only to one is because the second person who made an Eruv is deceased. If that's the case, in the next in the third or fourth line of the brisa, which it says that 2 people made an Eruv and 1 didn't make an Eruv, the one cannot relinquish to the one who didn't make an Eruv. The one who did make an Eruv cannot relinquish to the one who didn't make an Eruv. Wait, but in that scenario, the reason is because there are 2 people who made an Eruv, and if he relinquishes, he's leaving the other one out to dry. He's leaving him without an Eruv. But if he's already deceased, and that's the way Rabbi is defining the Mishnah in this brisa, then what's the problem with relinquishing to the one who didn't make an Eruv? Elopshita, the Isay, must be that the person did not die. There are multiple people who made an Eruv and they're still there. Only the Sefer Isay, Reisha Nami Isay. And if that's true at the end of the brisa, the beginning is also talking about where no one died. So Gemara says, me the area. Who tells you that that's the case? Is that have to be so? Each one could be as its scenario. There are multiple scenarios, and in the first scenario, there's only one person remaining of those that made an Eruv. And actually, Rabbi says, I can prove it to you. Teda. Because you can know this, the Ktani Sefer Dereisha. Because in the beginning of the brisa, there were 2 cases. The first case of the brisa was one person didn't make an Eruv. He's going to relinquish to one person of those that did make an Eruv. The next line it says 2 people that did make an Eruv, that made an Eruv can relinquish to the one who did not make an Eruv. And then it says 2 that didn't make an Eruv will give to 2 that did make the Eruv. Now, what's that case? That's why does it say over there they're giving to the 2? they have to give to both that made an Eruv, but not to the one that, but not just to one. So you see that in the first case, the one person is giving to one, and in the third case of the brisa, really, the two that didn't make an Eruv are giving to two that did make an Eruv. Wait, what I need them to give to two, they can give to one. So you see that there must be a distinction between the first case and the third case is that in the first case, there was an Eruv made, but one of the members died and all that's left is one member, so you can relinquish to him. And in the third case, in the next case of the ones that didn't make an Eruv relinquishing is where the two people that did not make an Eruv are relinquishing to all the people that did make an Eruv, and that's two. Rabbi Amar, my lebeis le'echad mishnayim. Abai says no, it doesn't mean that he's relinquishing to each of the other two. What it means is he's relinquishing to either of the other two, of the two that made an Eruv. Then it should say to one of those that made an Eruv. Or it should say to one that didn't make an Eruv. Why did it say that he's relinquishing to two? Kasha. So indeed, that's a question according to Abaye. So again, Rabbah says that when you relinquish, you have to relinquish to each member of the Eruv committee, of those that did participate in the Eruv. Abaya says that you only have to relinquish to one of the group. Rabbah has to explain the first line in the Mishnah where it says that you relinquish to one of those that made an Eruv, that he's the only remaining one, that whoever he made an Eruv with is no longer there. And Rabbah proves his point from the later part where it says two people that didn't make an Eruv have to relinquish to two people that did make an Eruv. Why do you have to relinquish to two? It should say to one of those that made an Eruv. And that's going to be a question to Abai. The Brisa further said, so what's that case? One that did not make an Eruv is going to give his to one that did make an Eruv. La'abaya de Isay. To Abaya, it's talking about that there are multiple people in the courtyard and that made an Eruv. And it's teaching us, the first line is teaching us that you only have to relinquish to one of the group, that made an Eruv. You don't have to relinquish to everybody, to individually that made the Eruv. L'Rabba, the Havamis, Rabba is going to interpret that first line, that there were multiple people that made an Eruv, at least two, and only one is left alive. Or one is there, V'lei Gazer, and there's no Gzeira, Zimnin de Isay, V'shnayim, that we're not concerned that maybe if now you're going to relinquish to one, even if the others are alive, you're going to relinquish to one and it's not going to be valid. No, we're not concerned about that. It says also that two people that made an Eruv can relinquish to the one who did not make an Eruv. That seems obvious. Maybe we should say, since he didn't make an Eruv, we should penalize him and he cannot receive the rights to the courtyard and thereby carry, because he didn't make an Eruv, he should have participated. He can relinquish his, but it can't be relinquished to him, and we would punish him for not participating in the Eruv. The teacher says, no, if he's the one that, if they want to relinquish to him because he needs to carry something out, whatever the scenario is, they're willing to do so, that it works. The next part of the Brisa said, two people who did not make an Eruv can relinquish their rights to two people that did make an Eruv. So according to Rabbah, this is teaching us the idea that he was saying from the beginning, that you always have to relinquish to each member of those that participated in the Eruv. And it teaches us at the first line that says that you relinquish to one is talking about that there were multiple, but they're no longer there. La Abaye. But according to Abaye, why does it say this? It's telling you that even though that there were more than one person that didn't participate in the Eruv, they can relinquish. Because the halacha is they cannot receive a relinquishment because it won't help. Two people that forgot to make an Eruv, if they receive the relinquishment, we saw earlier and in the Mishnah that if everybody relinquishes to the two, it's still not going to be a valid Eruv because you still have two entities in this courtyard. And it may be two people that forgot an Eruv cannot relinquish on account of that they can't receive relinquishment either. Kamash Malan, that's why the Bryce has to tell us that it's okay. It says, two people that that did make an Eruv can relinquish to one that didn't make an Eruv. Lamali, what I need to tell you that maybe it's only if some people made an Eruv and some people didn't make an Eruv. Then you can do this halacha of relinquishment. But if no one in the courtyard made an Eruv, they can't all relinquish to one, even though that essentially it's going to remain a single entity, and so therefore it's like putting the bread into one basket where they become a single entity. When everybody relinquishes rights to one, it also is one entity, but still I would have thought that you couldn't do that. Why? Because liknasinu, perhaps we should penalize this courtyard because otherwise people are going to forget the halacha of Eruv, and since you didn't make an Eruv, maybe you could, no one can relinquish. And you can only relinquish if at least some people made an Eruv, then those that didn't make an Eruv can relinquish. Kamash Malah. That's why it tells us that even if no one made an Eruv, they can all relinquish their rights to one, and that person can carry. But an individual that did make an Eruv cannot relinquish his rights to one that did not make an Eruv. And we explain that because he's ruining it for the other people in the Eruv. So according to Abaye, this is teaching us that there are multiple people that made an Eruv, and that's why and that's why he can't relinquish on behalf of everyone else because he's ruining it for them. And that shows that the first line, when it says that you can relinquish to one, is also talking about the multiple people that made the Eruv, and that proves Abaye's point that you only have to relinquish to one of the group. So one can receive on behalf of the group, but one cannot make a decision to relinquish on behalf of the group. L'Rabba, Aidi the Tani Reisha, Tani Nami Sefer. According to Rabba, really there's no necessity to say this because, yeah, it could be he's already deceased and there's only one, but once we already said the first line, we said the next line also. Another line in the Brisa was, two people that made an Eruv cannot relinquish to two people that did not make an Eruv. And now that too is pretty obvious because they didn't make an Eruv. So if everybody relinquishes their rights to the two of them, you're left with two entities and you can't carry in the courtyard and invalidates it. So what I need this. It's telling us that even if subsequently to everybody relinquishing to the two, one of them relinquishes to the other and it remains a single entity. Perhaps that would work. Kamash Malan, it doesn't work. Why? As we've been explaining before, at the moment that the group relinquished their rights to the two of them, nobody could carry in this courtyard. The ones that relinquished don't own their rights anymore. The ones that received it are two entities and they can't carry. So the concept of relinquishment will not work anymore in this case. So no one could carry in this courtyard. So the relinquishment to the two did not work. Therefore, one can no longer one of the two that received the relinquishment doesn't have the rights or the ability anymore to relinquish to the other. Furthermore, it said two people that didn't make an Eruv, meaning there's four people in the courtyard. No one made an Eruv. Two people that didn't make an Eruv cannot relinquish to the other two that didn't make an Eruv, because you're still left with two. What I need to tell you that seems pretty obvious. Even if they specifically said, here, we're relinquishing our rights to the two of you, and you receive it with the intent that you're going to pass it on to the next. Nevertheless, it won't work, because at the moment of relinquishment, there was still no rights to carry in the courtyard. That's the end of the explanation of this brisa, but the machlokas remains. According to Rabbah, you have to relinquish to each and every member of the courtyard in order for it to work. And according to Abaye, you only have to relinquish to one on behalf of the group. Bayimine Rava mirav Nachman Yorish Maya Sheyavata Rishus. Rava asked Rav Nachman, what about someone who inherited on Shabbos? That means that within this courtyard, there are multiple people living in the courtyard or in this alleyway, and there's a father and a son there as well. And the father forgot to make an Eruv prior to Shabbos. And then he passed away on Shabbos, and the son inherits the father's property. Can he relinquish on behalf of his father who never made an Eruv on Shabbos? So we turn to Ayin Amud Beis for this discussion. So if the father prior to Shabbos could have made an Eruv if he had wanted to, so then on Shabbos itself, the relinquishment can be done on his behalf. Aval hai, kivan the boil eruvi me esmo, but the son, if he would have wanted to make an eruv yesterday, leimotzi ma'arif, so he could not make an eruv because on behalf of his father because it was a separate entity. The father that property was a separate property. Leimotzi mavata. So now he also cannot relinquish because he cannot relinquish something where at the onset of Shabbos, when the Eruv should have been made, he didn't have that part. He could not have made that Eruv for this property. Or do we say no? The heirs are stand-ins for the father, and therefore it's as if the father is there. They're just there by the heirs, by their proxy. The father's there by the proxy, and so therefore he can stand in place of his father and relinquish the property that the father did not make an heir for on Shabbos. So Rav Nachman said, indeed, it is my opinion that he can relinquish on behalf of his father. However, However, the students in the Academy of Shmuel, they say that you cannot relinquish. It's interesting that it says that Hani Devei Shmuel, these students of Shmuel. Shmuel was the head of the academy in Naharda, which had to close, and they moved into the students moved into the other yeshivas, but they were students of Shmuel, and so in Rav Nachman's case, also there were students that still maintained the teachings of Shmuel in his yeshiva. Fine. So we have a machlokas here of whether or not in someone who inherited can relinquish on behalf of his father in the middle of Shabbos. So we're going to get into this idea of what are the rules that about half of Shabbos when something was at the onset of Shabbos in a certain state, in regards to Eruv, in regards to carrying, whatever it may be, does that change or does that remain for the rest of Shabbos? So we're going to ask a brisa, this is the rule. Anything that at the onset of Shabbos, for some duration of Shabbos was permissible, remains permissible for the rest of Shabbos. And anything that was prohibited from the onset of Shabbos remains that way for the rest of Shabbos. And the only exclusion is someone who relinquishes his rights, where at the onset of Shabbos, the courtyard cannot be used because somebody forgot to participate in the Eruv. And when he relinquishes, everybody can now participate, can now carry. So, Kol Shahuta L'Miktzah Shabbos Muta L'Chol Shabbos. What's the case of anything that was permissible at the onset of Shabbos remains permissible through Shabbos? Kegoin, Eruv Derech HaPesach, V'nistam HaPesach. Two courtyards side by side. The halacha is, in order for them to make an Eruv together, there has to be some sort of entryway, some sort of connection between the two courtyards. It can't just be that they're both open to the alleyway or to the street. There has to be an opening between them. So they have a door or a window, and between the two courtyards in their fence, a doorway in the fence or a window in the fence. And then on Shabbos, it somehow becomes blocked up. So now, at the onset of Shabbos, they made an Eruv together on account of that there was an opening. But now that the opening is blocked, perhaps the Eruv is done and they cannot carry from one courtyard to the other. Kamash Malan, this says, no, actually, once at the onset of Shabbos, it was permissible. Even if the doorway gets blocked, it's still permissible. Nistam HaPesach, Erev Derech Halon, or if they made an Erev through the window, meaning on account of the connection through a window, and Nistam HaChalon, and that got clogged, that's going to be permissible. But it says a haklal. This is a general rule. What's that adding? La'asuyeh mavui. To tell you, in an alleyway, we saw at the beginning of the Masechta, an alleyway, in order to be able to carry in there, you, besides for the joint meal that you have to make some demarcation at the end, which has either a vertical post at the side called the lechi, or a horizontal post across called the korah. And then on Shabbos, and you had one at the beginning of Shabbos, but during Shabbos it was removed, whether it fell off or whatever happened. So Mavish and Nitil Karosov Lechayav. The lechi or the korah was removed. So that's going to still be permissible, since at the onset of Shabbos you were allowed to carry, you can continue carrying. Kol nesar lemiktzah Shabbos, nesar chala Shabbos. Similarly, we said anything that was prohibited to carry at the onset of Shabbos, anything that was prohibited at the onset of Shabbos remains prohibited for the rest of Shabbos. What's that case? Kagoyin shnei batim shnei tzidir reshus harabim. Two houses on the opposite sides of a public domain, as we saw earlier, where obviously you're not allowed to carry from one house to the other because you're carrying across a public domain. But then a construction crew came, non-Jews came in the middle of Shabbos and put up a fence, and now there's a fence between them. Ve'kifum nachrim, and they were now they have four walls. Whether it's two walls of the house or complete in circle, it doesn't make a difference. The point is you now have four walls around the public domain, and so you're allowed to carry. So that was prohibited at the onset of Shabbos, remains prohibited throughout Shabbos. Because at the onset of Shabbos, they could not have made an Eruv, and therefore they cannot relinquish rights to each other now either. And therefore it's not going to be valid. And why does it say that this is a general rule? So it's not only one case, it's multiple cases. What's that adding? The case is that there was a non-Jew who was in this house, in this courtyard, and they didn't lease the land from him before Shabbos. And therefore, at the onset of Shabbos, the group could not make an Eruv, because you can only make an Eruv if it's a single entity in the courtyard, but there's a non-Jew in the courtyard, and you have to lease the land from him, and you didn't. So the Eruv at the onset of Shabbos didn't work, and now if he dies in the middle of Shabbos, you still cannot make an Eruv, cannot carry in there, even though that everybody is in the Eruv. That's everybody that's left is a single entity. But since at the onset of Shabbos you couldn't make the Eruv, so even though he died in the middle of Shabbos, at the onset of Shabbos prohibited to carry, it remains so for the rest of Shabbos. Uktani. Yet we learn chutz mimavatel rishus. There's one exception, that somebody relinquishes his rights in the middle of Shabbos to the rest of the group, which made an Eruv. That's going to be a valid relinquishment. And in the middle of Shabbos, it changes from not being allowed to carry to being allowed to carry. And this is according to Beis Hillel in the Mishnah, which said that even on Shabbos the relinquishment works. However, it says what we want to deduce from this brisa, from the fact that it says mavatel rishus, that's the only exception, is somebody who relinquishes his rights. Ihu in, only he himself can do so. However, yarish loy, but the inheritor cannot. So we see that like the students of Shmuel, that only the person himself that could have made an heir of the onset of Shabbos and didn't is the one that can relinquish. But the heirs who were not able to make an heir for this property at the onset of Shabbos because their father was still alive cannot relinquish on Shabbos. So Gemara says, no, that's not the meaning. It doesn't mean to the person himself who is relinquishing. What it means is the concept of relinquishment of property. That's the only time where that in the middle of Shabbos, the halacha can change from not carrying to carrying. but it doesn't mean an individual has to be the one to relinquish his own property, or the one who was there before Shabbos, but it could also be the heirs. It's still within the same halachic concept, the same principle of relinquishment. And that principle is where that it can change in the middle of Shabbos, whether the person himself or whether they're heirs. So we ask a question. One member of the courtyard dies on Shabbos and left in his will, he left his property in this courtyard to someone who doesn't live in the courtyard. If he died before Shabbos, so the fact that somebody that doesn't live in the courtyard now owns this property is going to prohibit the property for the heir for everyone else because he's not participating, and so you have a outsider that has possession of this land because he has some house there and he's not participating in the Eruv. However, if at the onset of Shabbos the person was still alive and then he passes away on Shabbos, the fact that someone else owns this property out and doesn't live in the courtyard, that's not going to prohibit because at the onset of Shabbos it was permissible to carry in here. The same in the reverse. Somebody who owns a property in this courtyard but doesn't live here and didn't participate in the Eruv, so that's going to invalidate the Eruv. But he left in his will the property for this courtyard that he owns, this house that he owns in the courtyard, to one of the neighbors that lives in the courtyard. So if he dies prior to Shabbos, so then the neighbor who owns this house, who just freshly inherited this house in the courtyard, participates in the Eruv, and then it's going to be a good Eruv. So it's not going to prohibit. However, if he died after the onset of Shabbos, so at the onset of Shabbos there was someone who didn't participate in the Eruv but had a house in the Eruv, so it's going to prohibit, even though that he inherited, he essentially gave over, bequeathed it in his will to this person that lives in the courtyard on Shabbos. So now, why does it prohibit nivatel? Let the person who inherited this house that lives in the courtyard relinquish that space to the rest of the courtyard, and then everybody now has the Shabbos for this Shabbos has the rights to that property, and it should work. So why did the Brisa say that if the fellow who does not live in the courtyard passes away on Shabbos, even if he bequeathed it to someone in the courtyard, it's going to ruin the Eruv because at the onset of Shabbos you couldn't carry. Now you can't carry. Well, actually, since someone in the courtyard inherited this, he can just relinquish the rights. So Gemara says, you're right. It means at first it's going to prohibit everybody from carrying until such time that he relinquishes rights. He could relinquish. It's just that right away at the onset, it's going to make the courtyard prohibited from carrying on account of that. There's this property that not participate in the Eruv, but right now there's a new since he inherited it, he can now relinquish on Shabbos. So let's try and prove this question of whether or not somebody who inherited can relinquish or not. Tashema, Yisrael v'ger sheruim b'megura. A born Jew and a convert, a ger, are living together on this farm. Okay, so they're out in a harvest. At the megura is where the silo is, etc. So they're living together. They have this place there with separate rooms. Each one is open to the courtyard, and they have to make an eruv. Umeis ger meba'odyom. The ger, the convert, who has no heirs, passed away before Shabbos, which essentially the Yisrael, the Jew that remains, can inherit that by making a chazaka, by acquiring by doing a show of ownership to that asset, which now has no he has no heirs, so he can acquire that asset. Alpha P, so now we're on Ayin Aleph at the top. Alpha P shehichzik Yisrael, even if the Yisrael who remains did some action in order to acquire it, and the Gemara is going to explain that later. Even if a different Jew made a acquisition of that property, that's going to prohibit. However, if the ger passed away on Shabbos, even if no one else acquired, it does not prohibit. So the Gemara is going to agufakashi. The Gemara is challenged, like, what's going on? He said at first, at the onset, if he passed away prior to Shabbos, even though somebody else made an acquisition. But if nobody, meaning even though somebody made an acquisition, no, it's only because someone else made an acquisition. Therefore, there are two entities here, and it's going and you can't carry. But if no one else made an acquisition of the property of the ger, then what remains is a single entity here, and then then he should be allowed to carry it. If nobody made an acquisition here, nobody's there to acquire the land, and therefore there's only one entity, and he should be allowed to carry. You're right. It means even though no one else made an acquisition, the Yisrael, the remaining Jew, cannot carry on account of that the ger's property is a separate entity. Because the Yisrael did not do any action to inherit, to acquire the land of the ger before Shabbos, and therefore it remains a separate entity for Shabbos. But it doesn't say that in the Brisa. The Brisa actually says, even though someone else did make an acquisition. Even though that the other person only showed ownership on Shabbos, meaning before Shabbos no one made an acquisition, he himself should have inherited prior to Shabbos, should have done something to acquire, and he didn't, that's going to prohibit it. So tomorrow we'll continue with